started. So welcome everyone. My name is Emmett Collins. I'm the chair of IPAC Manitoba, and I'm very happy to be hosting this webinar today with the team that developed the Certificate of Indigenous Relations program. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. IPAC Manitoba is based out of Winnipeg, which is located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Welcome to today's event. Just a little bit of housekeeping, and then I will pass the floor. One thing I want to mention is that for the most part, we will be sharing a presentation, but if you want to change your view so that you're only seeing who's speaking, you can toggle up on the right-hand side, either speaker view or gallery view. Everyone is muted by default, and we'll ask that you keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. For the sake of simplicity, we're asking that people provide any questions they have in the chat rather than waiting to do questions orally. So you can add those questions at the chat at any time, and we will get to them towards the end. And then finally, I want to mention that this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube at a later time. So today's Lunch and Learn is about the Certificate of Indigenous Relations program, or CIRP. Founded in 2016, CIRP was created by a small group in the Manitoba Department of Conservation and Climate. It was actually called, that was 2 or 3 names ago, but that's what it's called now. And it was also expanded later to the Department of Agriculture and Resource Development in 2018. In 2020, the program won the gold medal at the IPAC Deloitte Public Service Leadership and Excellence Award, which is a national award. So we're very excited to hear about this, and I've been very interested in seeing this. So I will now pass the floor to Rebecca McKay. Rebecca, do you want me to start sharing the presentation right away?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Emmett. I'd like to thank you for starting with the traditional land acknowledgement as it guides our work today. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we need to remember and respect the land, the air, the water, the earth, the birds, the four-leggeds, the insects, the fish, and aquatic species. With these gifts, we enter into a conversation about Indigenous relations. My name is Rebecca McKay, and I'm presenting to you today with Alex Miller, Wendy Carnegie, and Heather Miltenberg. We represent a portion of our respective work groups. We're happy to present to you today about the Certificate of Indigenous Relations program. We call it CIRP, an educational program that was recognized and awarded by our provincial level public service award, as well as recognized by your own national IPAC Public Sector Leadership Award, as Emmett mentioned. Thank you for that and for inviting us today. We're very proud of this program, and we're glad to have the opportunity to share this information with you. And the next slide. So it all starts with us doing our various jobs, trying to figure out how to engage Indigenous communities and trying to reflect Indigenous interests in our policies when we were presented with an opportunity. In 2015, Canada was presented with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report and call to action. And it was at this point that CIRP began to grow, particularly from the call shown here, action number 57. Provide education to public servants on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. This is a clear outline and a recipe for a plan. So 7 of us were brought into a room to consider the idea of an educational program. and immediately began throwing ideas together. This group would be the first cohort of the CIRP Planning Committee. We worked hard and our inspiration snowballed, and the program unfolded in that first year. With a small window of time to create a program, we outlined the modules based on this call to action. History, law, rights, Aboriginal-Crown relations, engagement, it's all there. So we worked our way through module development, and the government of Manitoba provided support as well. Specifically, at the time that we were launching CIRP, at a departmental level, the Manitoba government as a whole was also taking steps to advancing reconciliation. In March of 2016, Manitoba unanimously ratified the Path to Reconciliation Act. The Act was the first reconciliation legislation of its kind in Canada. The Act sets out the government of Manitoba's commitment to advancing reconciliation, guided by the TRC's calls to action. CIRP falls in line and contributes to broader government commitments and mandates. The next slide. So we worked hard, and why should we put so much work into the creation and implementation of this learning program? As you'll see outlined in this presentation, CIRP was an opportunity for experiential learning, increased awareness, and work that supports both reconciliation and government strategies. The structure we outline in this presentation is a program that facilitates learning so that public servants can start to think differently about what they do. The different way of thinking that could be called the Indigenous lens is a slow but steady culture shift in the public service. The program helps one participant at a time, in their own way, begin to figure out where they fit in the treaty relationship that is Canada. I'll now pass the slides on to Alex Miller.
So building on, next slide, please. So building on the idea of a need for a culture shift that Rebecca mentioned, and further to government's commitment outlined into the Reconciliation Act, in February of 2018, the Manitoba government released a Transforming the Manitoba Public Service, a Strategy Action Plan. The transformation strategy provides a plan to transform the work of the public service and build a culture that is forward-thinking, creative, and outcome-driven. One of the core principles of the strategy is advancing reconciliation, which recognizes that transformation of the culture of the public service can only be successful if reconciliation is woven into the fabric of our culture. The plan reinforces that every Manitoba public servant has a role to play in advancing reconciliation. It outlines that we must make sincere and meaningful change in the way we provide public service and consider opportunities to co-create solutions to Manitoba's greatest challenges together. In Manitoba, we are lucky that our CIRP has aligned with greater government commitments on reconciliation, as well as department-specific mandates and priorities. So besides alignment with key government objectives, some of the other key components needed for a successful program include the ones outlined on the slide. So support from executive is very important. Executive must acknowledge that there's a need for education and also to provide the space and permission for staff to take work time to participate. Making sure your programs align with mandates and priorities is essential. There also has to be some financial commitment. Speaker fees, culturally appropriate venues, and food are the bulk of the program costs. Also, resources such as books, treaty maps, certificates, honoraria for elders, presenter gifts, and tobacco offerings are other expenses to consider when trying to develop a program. The available budget provided will impact your program design and delivery. Dedicated planning team who not only delivers the program and sets the agenda, they facilitate learning sessions and support participants through their journey. And I call it a journey for a reason. We strongly recommend that the planning team have Indigenous representation and an advising elder who can guide and support delivery of culturally appropriate content. Dedicated and willing participants is another key component. One of the core values of the CIRP is that it is voluntary. It's important for all who participate to want to be in the program. Those that do not want to be there will not be open to learning and may make it harder for others to engage. The free will to participate is also of Indigenous value we consider important to uphold when developing a program such as the CIRP. We also have participants come all over from Manitoba, including all the way from Thompson. So it's an inclusive program. Establishing partnerships is also key. We are lucky in Manitoba to have the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, U of M, we've made roads with Red River College, and we have a number of partnerships with communities, such as Fisher River Cree Nation. We've gone to Broken Head Ojibwe Nation, amongst many others. And finally, a commitment of time. This program is structured to build knowledge and understanding, and allowing time for reflection and hopefully personal growth. Changing cultural mindsets and building relationships takes time. If this program can be done in a week, but you will not benefit from the time commitment and the ability for reflection and personal growth. Next slide, please. So how do we approach the call of action through the Certificate of Indigenous Relation program? As we approach it as a year-long experiential learning journey in Indigenous relations, specifically designed for Manitoba civil servants in the natural resource areas. A high-level overview of CIRP has the following program components, which will be outlined in more detail later in this presentation. The program overview includes 6 themes or modules that can come directly from the call to actions. We use local venues, and we take our classroom out of the office to culturally appropriate and thematically aligned locations. We strongly recommend in getting out of the boardroom to engage in advanced connection and relationships with the community. We incorporated an overnight stay with First Nation. An overnight trip to meet the community and representatives will help build relationships over time. This is sometimes even a first participants to be on a reserve. We have been fortunate to have been hosted by Fisher River Cree Nation multiple times in our program. If there is a willingness, you will find partners. Guest speakers. The program planning committee is not made up of Indigenous relation experts, so we rely heavily on guest speakers. We facilitate activities and speakers that are the experts on each module topic. We invite elders to speak, teach, and guide discussions. Incorporating cultural learning methods such as a sharing circle is important. Sharing circles are used as a learning tool throughout the year in many of our modules. Participants are required to attend at least one special event over the year. The planning committee offers a number of opportunities that include Indigenous events in the city, Métis history tour, and museum tours. We're very fortunate that we have the Human Rights Museum in Manitoba, in Winnipeg. Participants are also encouraged to seek out special events in various parts of the province, especially if they don't live in Winnipeg. Assignments are an important part of the CIRP program. Participants are assigned readings and viewing materials between classroom days and related questions. There's only so much class time one has to cover certain topics, and you never have enough time in class. We also require participants to write brief highlight stories about their experiences that then is shared with all staff in the department. We encourage ways for participants to pass on knowledge and awareness to their coworkers. And our program ends with accumulation of all that a participant has picked up over the duration of the program, and they present an action plan to their cohort and how they will carry their learning forward. Though this overview may look daunting, the CIRP model framework is adaptable and can be modified to fit program needs, objectives, and budgets, which is exactly what Wendy will discuss next in regards to the development of the Manitoba Agricultural Program.
Thank you, Alex. Hope everyone can hear me. I just actually want to start by saying that the Agriculture CIRP Committee is grateful to be mentored by and work in partnership with our climate and conservation colleagues on developing a CIRP program to fit our needs. Your team has been a tremendous help. For us, our own journey started in 2017 when the then Department of Agriculture policy team was staffed with reviewing programming models under existing and future funding frameworks and understanding the rate of Indigenous participation. Through this review and rating process, it was recognized that although Indigenous applicants were eligible for existing programs, there was very low uptake. And this led to some questions, and eventually it spurred us to create an Indigenous engagement strategy that focused on addressing some key goals, such as supporting sector economic development for Indigenous people and communities, increasing program uptake by Indigenous people, youth engagement and awareness initiatives for the sector, and an overall need to increase our departmental relationships with communities. The strategy was founded on the 94 calls to action and outlined specific calls that the department was positioned to address. It was noted that Call to Action 57 was a critical first step to advance on other goals. Without doing some effective training, we wouldn't be able to actually address other issues as well. We're fortunate that some of our department staff had heard about the CIRP program through other avenues at presentations, and the information about it was kind of trickling to us. And that spurred us to reach out to the former Sustainable Development team and learn more about that CIRP program and how to adopt and adapt the program to our unique needs. Next slide, please. The SD CIRP team was generous in sharing their knowledge and experience, and our own committee was built from staff that represented the departments and different viewpoints and work roles. And we were able to work with and evaluate delivery options and program changes to make that CIRP program work for our own goals. This collaboration was key to our success. The SD model is rich and demonstrates the strong relationships they have built over time with communities and individuals. Our own team came into this work without those connections. And to be honest, initially the idea of CIRP was slightly intimidating, and in some respects, replicating what SD had created felt overwhelming given our own budget differences and time, and that we didn't have an existing network. But through their support, and through the support from colleagues in other departments like INR and Economic Development and Training, our group was able to take this CIRP program and align it with our mandate and needs to create a unique version and delivery model to suit our own purposes. For example, our field trip was very different. We went to a community just for one day, and rather than an overnight visit, but we were able to go to a community that was located on prime agriculture land that they have not been able to move into production for their community's benefit at this time. The value from this experience, although different, was still very immense and created lots of opportunity to learn. We also tried to ensure that all of our events allowed for connections with our sector. And often we sought speakers with experience or knowledge of the agriculture sector that could connect the discussion to our own roles in the department. Next slide, please. So, although the ag team does not yet have the same history, we're still learning and very new to this process and journey, but we are seeing changes after even a single CIRP cycle, and that culture shift that has been mentioned earlier is ongoing as we continue to learn collectively. For example, some former participants are in the process of enacting their action plans, which is really exciting. We've been able to deliver impactful one-day training sessions for targeted audiences to support understanding process, such as application and review challenges for Indigenous people. And there's an increased dialogue about how we can partner with Indigenous communities, businesses, and individuals. We're currently working on a few really exciting projects, and I do believe that CIRP has served to advance those or create those opportunities for us. Right now, we're excited to be partnered with 2 Indigenous students from the U of W. They're leading an Indigenous youth engagement process to help us hear from Indigenous youth themselves how better we can inform about the industry and career opportunities therein. We're working towards a regional collaboration project with Saskatchewan and Alberta currently that will collect meaningful data from Prairie Region First Nation communities about actual sector interests and what effective programming would look like for them. And we're really hoping that will guide our future framework development processes. We've been able to participate on a newly formed FPT Indigenous Agriculture Working Group. Exciting to be part of those calls and understand what's happening across Canada in the sector. And there's ongoing discussions about how to support community members in program application writing and considerations for how to deliver application writing workshops. I just wanted to close quickly and just say again that our team really values the partnership with the CNC development team. And we anticipate with recent organizational changes that we'll see even more potential to do good work. With that, I'd like to just pass the presentation to Heather. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, it's been great working with you guys too. We're definitely learning a lot and sharing information, so looking forward to more of that. So now I'll just go into an overview of the program's content. Everyone can hear me okay, right? Good, okay, awesome. So the program consists of 6 modules, and as Rebecca was describing, they were modeled after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to action number 57, and the order is not an accident, so there was a lot of thought that went into, you know, which module comes first and, you know, the order of content basically. I also think it's worth repeating that the course was designed as an experiential learning opportunity. And so like Alex mentioned, when we offered this course in person, we'd ensure class days would take place outside of government buildings and in culturally significant locations or within communities. And so I think this alone has aided CIRP in developing relationships with communities and organizations as the program has matured. So we'll go to the next slide. So the first module is called Historical Perspectives. And so this module sets the framework for and dives into a timeline of Canada's history. And so things we touched on during this module include the history of pre and post contact, history of treaties in Manitoba, the treaty relationship, modern day application of treaties, and we also incorporate a blanket exercise, which is meant to be a participatory historical lesson of assimilation, basically. And I highly recommend looking into that. For, like Wendy was saying, they do it at their, I think, divisional and branch meetings, I think annually, she was saying, and I definitely would recommend taking part in that. Yeah, and we can go to the next slide. Module 2 is Indigenous Law. So it's meant to provide an introduction to the legal process with a specific focus on Section 35 of the Constitution, implications of Aboriginal case law and Supreme Court decisions, legislation and law as it relates to the management of resources in our department. We bring in the government's constitutional lawyers, as well as speakers that can speak to law from an Indigenous perspective. So, and other topics include the Indian Act, the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement, White Paper, Section 35 and the Duty to Consult, Path to Reconciliation Act, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then not listed here is governance and lawmaking within communities, and as well as water law. So, yeah, and then Module 3 is Consultation and Accommodation. And so Module 3 is meant to be an introduction to Manitoba's Crown Indigenous consultation process and accommodation measures, and is directly applicable to work undertaken in our departments. So topics include the provincial policy for Crown Corporation, or for Crown consultations. We go through completing an initial assessment to help staff determine what level of consultation is required in their areas of work. We talk about the phases of consultation, and we bring in department employees to discuss particular experiences doing consultation. So next slide. Module 4 is Community Engagement and Reconciliation. So this module expands on what we learned in Module 1 and dives deeper into the relationship between Indigenous communities and the Crown. So this is the module where we talk about the history of residential schools and their effects on intergenerational trauma, as well as the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We're very grateful that we have residential school survivors that come in and share their stories with us. And this makes for an incredibly impactful experience that helps shape and further our understanding going forward. This module can be fairly heavy, I'll mention, and this is one reason why we save this content for later. And we also actually bring in a counselor from the Employee and Family Assistance Program, just in case participants need to talk to them during the day when we go through this content. So then we have module 5. So this is current topics. So for this module, we review past, current, and developing Crown Aboriginal agreements and processes that our department manages with communities specific to natural resource management. And during this module, we also try to foster a better understanding of barriers facing communities and visit social enterprises actively working to break down these barriers. And topics have included issues related to drinking water, flooding, night hunting, pipelines, and also racism and stereotypes. So then module 6 is the final project or the action plan. So in order to receive their certificates, participants are required to complete a final project. In recent years, this has taken the form of an action plan, which highlights learning outcomes and actions taken over the course of the year. And participants present their action plans in a presentation on the final day. So, and it's just 5 minutes, so it's really not a lot. And then there's the CIRP graduation. So at the end of the year, certificates are presented to all participants who have completed course requirements. The final day is meant to be a celebration, and we bring in a drum group and invite speakers and elders who've shared knowledge with us throughout the year. We usually have lunch. So here we have a picture of our certificate and a copy of a commissioned art piece that goes along with every certificate. And so this art piece was commissioned for use by the program from a friend of mine, Chris Westcoop. He's a Dakota Ojibwe of Long Plain First Nation, and his art piece embodies what CIRP is meant to be. And I'll just read about it quickly because I find it really beautiful. So if we look at the picture down there, you can find the wampum belts from our graphic bordering the piece. The bear paw represents the courage to face fear, changes, or overcome challenges. A community stands behind the person in the middle, making their way forward, and eagle feathers surround the entire piece, representing the eagle's teaching of love, which can be found in the core of all teachings. So yeah, so with that, I think I'll pass it back to Rebecca, I believe.
And I have to unmute. There we go. Thanks, Heather. Thank you, everybody. I'm just going to go through a little bit about what we've seen happen through the program over our time. So through the honest and dedicated participation of people in the program, we've seen growth. We've seen strategies become stronger. In one example, our department asked each branch to update their Indigenous engagement strategies, which they each have. And the fun part is that CIRP had just asked participants to do that as an assignment, and they did this exact thing. So it was a direct application of their learning to their work, and their branches benefited because it proposed an update that was already done. And the best part is that the updates were based on experience and skills that the participants now had and they could now act on. So the branches gained a resource person and the strategies were stronger. We've also seen employees learn from each other and work together. People within the same department that have never worked together because they're in different areas or regions find out what the other does. They go through this learning experience together and they have a common understanding as a team. And we've seen people finish the program and then go on to work in other areas with other areas to resolve challenges and make connections that they may not have used before. We've also seen implementation of government programs that already exist. I've seen several examples where participants have taken the opportunity to talk to communities about what their program area is, and the community that they're learning with has a chance to learn about something that they could have been involved in all along. But through that conversation with members, our participants are able to promote their program directly with people who could be involved. And they also find out reasons why a community member may not have been involved in the past and what challenges there may be with that program. So this is a way that they have promoted their programs, made connections, but also learned how to engage and actually engage people in those. And we've seen an exchange of knowledge. People who enforce or manage natural resources are having candid conversations with Indigenous community members over a meal about hunting rights, their children, and most recent political developments. And they're not entering into that conversation to resolve an issue. They're entering that conversation to build a relationship and to learn. The exchange of information is so much more meaningful and the relationship is so much more possible. If there are not controversies that need to be resolved in a brief meeting. So in some cases, this might be the first time that public servants are talking to Indigenous people without worrying about making them angry. And this has led to meaningful relationships. And we've also seen participants apply their knowledge to their work. And I was lucky enough to be invited to a meeting with past participants I was helping them make a connection with an Elders Council to ask questions about traditional use in parks. And what I saw was very revealing to me. The CIRP alumni were respectful to the elders. Now, I'm not saying they would not have been respectful before CIRP, but when they offered tobacco, they understood the significance of what that meant. And when they asked for teachings and guidance, they understood the weight of what they were asking for. And they asked for a relationship and they offered it. And this was a treaty conversation like I have never seen before. It was very exciting. The next slide. So as we all take steps in the path to reconciliation, we're aware that it's complex and there's no quick answer. For instance, the CIRP module framework has been adopted by agriculture, as Wendy described, and they're applying it in a way that works for their department. And it's clear that every time Indigenous relations work is done, it will be different. And the path to reconciliation cannot be the same for everyone. Every year, we have found out that there's something new to talk about and a different way to look at challenges. We've adapted CIRP every year to make changes necessary for program improvement. We always choose to change something on purpose, and we always stumble upon change by accident, and both are necessary steps in our adaptive journey. We find a balance between what we know and can control and what we just need to roll with, and there's learning in both. Our future contains a CIRP that will be different again. We're entering into a distance learning platform, like what we're doing right now. And it's not ideal for building relationships as we've been accustomed, but the lesson we take from this year's CIRP will be to learn how to relate to each other in government at a distance. And as we do that, we learn how to relate with Indigenous communities at a distance at the same time. This will be new for the planning committee, it'll be new for the participants, and it is new for the Indigenous communities. It's an important lesson that our governments, as we're still required to consult with communities on decisions, and we need to figure out ways that are new, meaningful relationships at a distance. So I hope our participants will help us learn this in this new year. And we're happy to share this program with all of you as an example of ways to take steps forward in reconciliation, whether mid-journey or just starting. And when we started our pilot year in 2016, we knew what we wanted, but we didn't know how to get there. And having been given the opportunity to work on this program, and we enter into our 5th year, we're grateful for the journey we've been on and look forward to what's next. CIRP is simply a tool to facilitate learning, increase awareness, taking in a history that many don't fully understand, and applying that knowledge to change how governments build relationship. Treaties are here, we are in them, and we have a large task of figuring out how to take those little steps in a good way together. Thanks. I guess we'll move to the next slide and just see if there's any questions that people have.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm going to remind people to please add your questions in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, please throw them into the chat now, so that way we don't have people waiting to try and not interrupt each other.
And just as a note, our last slide shows some of the links to documents that we referred to in the presentation. So those might
Would it be possible for us to share this presentation with the attendees afterwards?
Yeah.
So we have a question from Paul Sheridan. When is the next intake? How can I register for the CIRP?
We are currently in our 5th year, so we've done our intake for this fiscal year. At this point, we've been doing a timeline of the entire fiscal year starting in March or beginning of April. And we're actually looking at changing that because of the resource areas that we're working with, where they have some busier times in summer and other times when our calendars don't align. So we're, again, adjusting what we're offering and trying to figure out what works for as many people as possible. And I would say ask people in your department, I'm not sure where you are, but about opportunities like this and how to be involved.
Question from Michelle Ma. I was wondering how I can go about to do work reconciliation initiatives in our workplace.
Can you repeat the question?
I think it's about how to, if there's, or beyond CIRP, what are the best ways of doing reconciliation initiatives in workplaces?
I think, and others can definitely contribute to this, but one of the things we've been told by our speakers and our specialists, our experts, is to review the calls to action and look at how they apply to you. One big question is, why does this call to action exist? And we've had that asked of us by a speaker, Kevin Lamoureux. Why do these actions exist? And then think about how you can address how to make that action happen in your own way. It's going to be small steps. It's going to be slow. There's no quick answer to that. That's a really big question. Does anyone else have answers to that they want to mention?
I can add just something. The Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba has a wealth of speakers that we pull from. And so bringing people in to discuss certain topics that you think would be helpful for your branch or your section, and doing a webinar like this with a speaker is absolutely helpful, and asking questions is also just a really good way to learn, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know, basically, right? And so I would definitely look into them and see if there's anything that you could find to connect to your department.
I'll add just to echo Heather's idea of looking at your mandate and looking at your priorities and what, if you're not from Manitoba, your government priorities, and sort of tying in and doing a gap analysis. The key thing is people need to recognize that education is required. And so then you have to identify what type of education and the best way to sort of go about doing that. So start small, like Heather said, bring in a speaker about a certain topic and relate it back to the work that you're doing. That seems to be what management would expect you to do, but that start small.
Okay. Another question from Michelle Ma. With so many different clans and groups, how can we work with different groups together as Indigenous people? So was there consideration given to sort of the distinctions based and that sort of thing?
Sorry. So it's just, I find that there's so many different groups across Canada, and I find that some, like for example, the events that you mentioned, sometimes some of the groups representative will be seen, but others, like I haven't heard a lot about Mi'kmaq people. I haven't heard from different clans in Inuk or other areas, and I just worry that it'll be another sort of like gap between hierarchy of Indigenous groups and within the Indigenous groups. And I also learned about like the chief that's a traditional chief in each group, as well as there's a chief representative that represents in like political parliament issues. So I know it's a big question, but what are ways that in those conversations can we have representative from more of the different groups?
So I think I'm unmuted. Yeah, it is a big question. And, you know, we obviously are focusing on what we can learn about Manitoba communities. And we can't cover everything. I mean, you need multiple years of Indigenous studies to learn about any one community. And the elders come with tidbits of information about the vast amount of knowledge that's going to be shared, and it would take so much time. So I think all we can do is engage with people who are engaging, and start there. And I find too that if you're really interested in a certain area that you want to find out more about, that approaching people and asking questions is often, you get a response, you get engagement, you get people are interested in sharing. So we've had good fortune that way. Heather or Alex, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Oh, that's good.
The only like the idea of partnerships, right? Reaching out to communities. Not every community is going to engage. No different than when you seek consultation on a decision that you need to make as government. Not every community engages, and so with this, you have to be very respectful, and you go in seeking knowledge from them, and not bringing your own agenda to the table. So I think that's really important. Seek out relationships, seek out partnerships, and when in doubt, stick with history then, right? Like learn your history, and then all the other things will come into play, in place, sorry.
So a couple of similar questions here from Sharon Schmidt and Shauna Wolf. And I encourage you to read the comment by Shauna because she's very complimentary, but I don't want to read the whole thing. But Sharon asks, will the certificate program be part of every department within government? And Shauna asks, have any other departments, provincial or federal, come forward to create their own version of CIRP?
So I guess answering the last part of that first, we've had conversations with people who are interested at the federal level and other provinces. And again, it's been such different material to have to cover in a program. It has to be that own provinces, that own jurisdictions program. For instance, in our conversation with some folks from British Columbia, they're dealing with a lot of territory that isn't under treaty. And so our whole process of consultation and our whole process of learning about treaties is completely a different history. They're related, definitely, but there's a lot of things that they need to change about what they present. Yeah, and I don't know if anybody else wants to talk to that.
I'm not hearing anything. I don't mean to interrupt.
I would just also say then that in terms of this being more broadly adopted and adapted, I think that it's a very adaptable program, and at the same time, it takes a lot of dedication from a group who's going to take it on. So it's not just an easy snap, here I have a program, let's go. It'll take some analysis and mistakes as you go along, and you sort of, you just, you know, work your way through it, and it does take dedication.
Another question, what are tips to talking to people who do not want to and are ignorant of the international issues of not reconciling with Indigenous people? Sorry, intersectional issues.
Really quickly, teach their coworkers. I know that there are challenging conversations, absolutely. We deal with racism, we deal with systematic issues that we're confronted with on a regular basis. And all we can do is try to educate, try to increase awareness. And we've seen people take this program and completely change how they don't even know what they don't know. And I know that's I'm borrowing that statement, but they said, I never heard any of this stuff before. What's going on? I've had people take one of the books that we hand out to people and knock at the door. We give that as material for our participants. Also a good resource, everybody. Knock at the door. He took it home and said, Dad, you got to read this. I'm not going to talk to you about residential schools again or any of these issues that you have until you read this book. So yeah, it's just like Alex was saying, we don't force people to take this program. That's not the intention. The intention is to encourage awareness, and people leave this program with a new confidence of having those conversations and practicing, like, oh no, I now have stuff I can go back to, family dinner. When my uncle says this thing, I'm going to respond with this, right? So there's a whole bunch of being able to articulate things like you've never been able to before. So I think that it's just, yeah, having that knowledge spread, whether people like it or not.
And creating a culture too, where those views are the minority, right?
Mm.
Those views take a back seat. So.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the program is you change one person at a time. We can't go out and change the entire culture of the government. And so that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to change one person at a time and, educate and learning the history. I mean, I think that is fundamental. If you don't know about treaties and, the key of we are all treaty people, if someone doesn't agree with that, they need the history to understand what that means. And you can't force people, certainly not, but we also have to recognize that we are government, and our colonial structure is in place that actually is very oppressive to First Nations, and we have to change our culture, and we have to be able to do that using education as a tool. So one step at a time.
I can just quickly comment on just our experience, maybe, which was a little bit different. When I started talking about this issue, I had a lot of not negative pushback, but definitely the conversation was that Indigenous people aren't farmers, and therefore, why do we need to go down this path? And so a very effective thing I did was actually just bring in archaeologists who didn't even get into reconciliation, the calls to action or anything, but just demonstrated the linkage between First Nation people and our sector. And that opened a conversation for us that up until that point was kind of dead. So it doesn't even have to be that level of conversation to start a dialogue. It just needs to be sometimes some proof to build that connection, to get people to start thinking.
So question here, has the Learning Fund provided opportunities for anyone from other departments to participate?
Alex, do you want to answer that one?
Sure, I'll take this one. So the last call for the Learning Fund for the government of Manitoba included the idea that if program or departments wanted to create their own CIRP, that there could be potentially funding available to them for that. It was clearly in the call for the funding, the Learning Fund. And so I would encourage, if there are other departments in the government of Manitoba interested in developing this, even if it's smaller, even if it's just putting on a couple of speaker bureaus, half-day sessions or webinars. It doesn't have to be the entire program the first run at it. The Learning Fund, it appears that central, government is interested and willing to help fund these programs. Requires some commitment to funds. Can't do it with, speakers don't come free. So I would encourage people to relook at that call for the Learning Fund.
So just to clarify, and I apologize if you mentioned this already, but is there a cost to individual government employees to participate in this program?
The budget that we've acquired for this program has, it covers the speakers and the venues and the food when we were at a time when we had venues and food. So the participants don't have a fee to participate unless they're traveling a distance, then they're responsible for their travel. So that is one challenge that we've had, and one part of this year's intake has been that they don't actually have to travel as much this year. So that part is nice. And we're also making plans to have other aspects more virtual, more at a distance learning type of opportunity. But yeah, in general, we have a certain number of openings every year, and the executive get together and decide who's going to participate. People can express to the executive they're interested, and then they get selected to be in the program. And that is the extent of their need to be involved.
Question here from Jessica. How does the program attempt to minimize the emotional labor done by Indigenous people in educating settlers about truth and reconciliation? I've heard a lot lately about the unfairness of expecting people who experience racism to teach about this.
I can try this one. So we go to a wide variety of speakers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and they include professors, elders, you know, and even our own department employees. So it's not all Indigenous people that we're going to, and we only, like everyone that we speak to is willing. Like we ask them to share with us, and if they are willing to share with us, they do. And so we're not, you know, putting someone in a position where they're not wanting to teach us, I guess, is my point of view. Rebecca, do you want to add to that?
I think there's always emotional labor on these subjects, and we work to bring in the information that is true and that is difficult at times. But we also work to leave people with hope. And so we encourage our speakers to do that as well. And it can be very challenging. And we've even had, I don't know who has all been involved in the blanket exercise, but that is a very challenging exercise for people to facilitate. And we actually have had a fair bit of turnover in people who are offering that because of its emotional toll. And so I think that also goes for speakers and people who are involved as speakers bureau members for the Treaty Relations Commission, that people need, they are taking care of themselves that way. And so when we rely on them, they need to tell us if they need to change something about it. So yeah, it is a challenge for sure, and everything is difficult in its own way.
I'll add the idea that we also bring in a lot of different perspectives, and we don't choose the conversation. And so we want to make sure that we're presenting all types of views, not just one view. And so, you know, under the law module, we bring in, you know, internal constitutional law lawyers that has a government perspective, and then we bring in an Aboriginal lawyer that practices, and we bring in an elder to talk about Indigenous law, which is not legal. It's talking about water law and the 7 sacred teachings. And so having those many different perspectives is very important. And sometimes participants leave uncomfortable, unknowing, with no answers, and that's the whole point. The whole point is to be able to demonstrate and show a whole vast knowledge that is out there. And you know, as government, we have to take those and sort of bring them all together and figure out a path forward.
And I'll add too, like the learning doesn't stop in the CIRP course, right? Like the journey doesn't end. And so we do expect our participants to go on in doing their assignments, and even further than that, to be able to educate themselves on the things that, you know, may interest them or they have questions on. And so it does fall on them, and they realize that that's an expectation that we have.
I'll maybe ask a question. So were there non-Indigenous people involved in the planning committee? And I don't know if there's need to discuss the proportion, but I can see non-Indigenous people being interested in starting something like this, but also hesitant. And I'm saying this because I would be interested in something like this for my department, but I don't know if I'm the person as a non-Indigenous person to occupy that space, or if someone else should be doing that.
I don't know if Wendy's able to answer that to start.
Try. Definitely that for us was probably a challenge. I'm not Indigenous, but I try to make connections and build relationships with people who are more knowledgeable than I am to help guide us. I'm lucky to have connected with people like Leona McIntyre from EDT, who provided a lot of guidance and insights and is Métis and does a lot of education work already. And so she was a great resource for us. And of course, our relationship with the former Department of SD team has been really beneficial and guided our process. I know Rebecca, or one of your members, was mentioning earlier how you have an elder that supports your development, and we don't have that on our team for sure. It would be something we'd like to work towards for sure. But I think if your intent is good, you'll do good work, and you'll find the connections and relationships to support you in doing good work. But if, I guess from my experience, being bold enough to step forward and say you want to do something, and taking action is the first step in doing it. And everything else does come together after. I don't know, does that answer your question?
And if I might add, like you say, Wendy, that there's a certain boldness, right? That you say, you know what, I want to learn about this. I know people need to learn about this. And I may not be Indigenous, but I want to offer this to my coworkers. So figure out ways to do it. And as an Indigenous person, I am excited to be invited to it, right? And be a part of this and part of the initial group that started it. So I think, so yes, as a non-Indigenous person, you can start to ask questions, and you can, you have to have that balance of being bold to ask those questions, but also humble to ask people to help you learn, and be asking for help, and be asking for knowledge, and not being the specialist and not being the boss. And that's part of our committee as well, being facilitators and not experts. We ask people to help us learn and to help our participants learn. And so you have to be bold enough to ask the questions and humble enough to listen. So that's what I would add to that. And allies are a huge part of any of this happening. So
and I wasn't lying when I said it is intimidating to pick it up, and it was very intimidating. I'm not Indigenous, so for me it was kind of, where do I start and how do I do this? But I did a lot of reading before I actually learned about the CIRP program, and I remember feeling like all of these strong emotions and wanting to learn more myself. So it was very easy to say we need to learn, and then I say it in air quotes, so we delivered a training program. Really, we were participants in a training program. We just brought in the people who know more than we can hope to, even start, and learn from them. And yeah, it's been fantastic.
One final question, and this is just to, you mentioned some of the challenges related to COVID and moving virtually. Is the plan for the next session to be done at least partly virtually?
Yeah, so we started our session late, simply because of COVID and not knowing where anybody was anymore. And then we are carrying on that way at this point. We hope that there will be opportunities for our group to meet, because we've mentioned in the presentation the importance of networking, the importance of relationship and sharing a meal, and all those things that you can't replace in any way. And for instance, the blanket exercise, we're looking at when that next opportunity is that we can all get together and do that, because the Kairos organization that does training in that subject area is also struggling to figure out how people can experience that learning without being there in person. So, and communities also don't want to, or I should say, it's also really difficult to build relationship on a computer screen. So all those things are challenging, and we hope that we can do a combination of things. I think a certain amount of information can be passed on this way, and then the remainder needs to be done in person. So I think we we have to figure out how to do that.
And one final question before we let you go. Are you aware of other programs? Were there other programs that you sort of drew inspiration from when designing this that you could point people to if CIRP is not available for them right now?
Okay, I guess I'll answer it again, but you guys feel free to talk as well. I think there's a lot of resources online that teach about history. A lot of universities are offering free courses. A lot of organizations are offering information. There's reconciliation groups. The Healing Foundation has a lot of resources on residential schools and how to reconcile that history. And there's different activities that are on there that you can do by yourself or with a group. So there's a lot of resources online that can at least give you ideas or start you on that learning journey. So there's a lot of things.
A lot of good books out there too.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say there's a lot of good books out there too. So just start reading and then start developing your competency based on that, where your interests lie and where you find gaps. It's good to go about that yourself too, because then you're kind of creating your own journey.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This is really enlightening, and I think everyone who's not in one of the departments that has this program really wishes that they'll be developed. So hopefully this launches some of that. But thanks again and have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.